Hello, everybody. Dr. Winkler again. It's a real pleasure to see you. Actually, I can't see you, but it's a real pleasure to know you're still with the program. You're still taking a hit for the team. We are now discussing Lecture 9 in the World War I class. We're getting into the issues of atrocities. Let's go back to our small discussion of yesterday, or last time, I should say, and take a look at the laws of war. Remember, I said that brutality, death, destruction takes place in wartime. And there's no doubt about that at all. But when you actually have an atrocity, you're killing people, shall we say, in the improper manner or at the wrong times. Then it becomes an atrocity. Remember the Hague Conventions, 1899, 1907. And I gave you a very brief outline as to the kinds of things that they are saying. Talking about the destruction of Belgium, the rape of Belgium, if you will. Remember, a lot of bad things do happen. But there's also an issue of propaganda. To exaggerate what was happening, to keep the home fires burning, shall we say, and also to try to influence neutrals, particularly the United States, into seeing that the British cause is just, the German cause is despicable, therefore the Americans should support, in an issue of all morality, should support the British cause, and later on even join in the fighting. Among the myths we see in the rape of Belgium, the British make a big deal, say, oh, the Germans are over there, and they get these little kids and they cut their hands off. They cut the hands off of men and boys so they cannot operate their weapons. This never happened. Remember, at the end of the war, there's a number of attempts by Americans and even by the papacy to locate these boys and these men, and they couldn't find even one, even when substantial amounts of money were offered. The irony here is, I talked about this last time as well, the Belgians cut off the hands of people in the Congo. And this is very well documented. Remember last time I even showed you photographs of of Africans, men in the Congo, men and women in the Congo who had their hands cut off by the Belgians. So getting down to perhaps the most well documented and among the most inexcusable things that happened in the conquest of Belgium. Remember, the Germans, shall I say, severely overreact. You catch a rifle, somebody takes a shot from the village, so you go in and kill all the men in the village, just to make sure that maybe you got the person. More than likely, the person who actually took the shot probably ran off and wasn't there to be caught anyway. Then it comes to the destruction of Louvain, or Leuven. Last time I was telling you a little bit about Louvain. Nice city, university town, the excellent library going way, way back, university library going way, way back. They have manuscripts there of great value historically, even from the Middle Ages. This is a treasure. It's a cultural treasure. And when there is some resistance. Now, sometimes we have to be a little bit, and I want to be fair to the Germans, but it's pretty hard to be fair to the Germans when they're acting so awfully. There was the supposition by some people, anyway, at least by the British, that the resistance, the rifle fire, whatever that had been received from Louvain, in reality was a fabrication. I don't think that's the case. But clearly what happened here was unacceptable, way, way beyond the laws of war, way, way beyond anything the Germans could have gotten out of it. The Germans actually plunder and burn large sections of downtown Leuven, including the university, including the magnificent library. We think it looks something like this before the destruction. You can see very large library, excuse me, Very large library, hundreds of books, thousands of books of great value all over here. And then it's literally turned into rubble. Areas are burned. You can see the areas right downtown are severely damaged. And rather than getting an apology from the Germans, I'm not sure what good an apology would have done yet after having done all of this. But as we look at the destruction, and these photographs do become known in the West, able to smuggle them out of Belgium, you do see that this is horrific. So it is very easy to paint the Germans as being these awful, terrible people who do awful, terrible things at virtually no provocation. So the war against the Germans is not just a political war where Britain is trying to maintain its political position. It is a war against evil. It is a war against these people that would do these awful things. In trying to better understand the German brutality during the First World War, I ran across an account by a German deserter. It was published anonymously in the United States. It's called The German Deserter's War Experience. He's with the German troops, and he's involved in the invasion of Belgium. Now, they're coming into Belgium, and some of the Belgians are nice to them, give them bread and some milk, and as the men are marching through. A lot of the Belgians are just simply afraid, and they get behind the doors and close them. That's very understandable. But there are times when the Germans are coming through, there's disruptions. Obviously, the Germans later on are going to be taking cattle and other foodstuffs. And there are German soldiers, according to the German deserter, where the Germans look around and say, oh, by the way, these people are suffering, they don't have enough food. And the German soldiers try to do something good for them. They try to get food, and they try to bring things to them, and come in and tell them, don't be worried, we won't hurt you, placing their minds at ease about a lot of issues. Now, that's very nice. But when the officers find out that these men are doing these kind of things, these benevolent Germans are subject to severe criticism and sometimes severe punishment. Sometimes they're tied up and humiliated in various ways, physically hurt. Now, wait a minute. Does this really mesh with the brutality of Germany? Yes and no. We say many of the Germans are trying to be decent guys. I have no doubt about that at all. But then they end up doing bad things. There's a lot of times when the Germans and French and Germans and British are fighting each other, and there's not a great deal of personal animosity between the fighting sides, I should say. But can we say they do bad things? They kill people when they don't want to kill people. They're brutal to the Belgians when they don't want to be brutal. What I think I'm seeing is that these men are actually good men, but there's a system, and the system is brutal. The officers have a tendency to be arrogant, they have a tendency to be mean, they have a tendency to say, you are wasting our food and our effort by helping the Belgians, so we're going to punish you for doing so. Is the system the culprit here? In many cases, I believe it is. Let's take a look at Edith Cavell. Edith Cavell was a nurse. She's a British nurse living in Belgium. I'm sure it's not like you can't go to Britain and find good places where a nurse is needed. Anyway, she's there before the war. When the Germans come sweeping through Belgium, she's behind the lines. Well, she has a facility where she can help people. Clearly, the Germans are bringing their medical facilities with them, their doctors, their nurses, setting up field hospitals. Of course, once they get into the cities, they do have a tendency to take over buildings and use them for the purposes of hospitals. Edith Cavell, let's get her up here. Edith Cavell, nice lady, Edith Cavell, get an image of her. Nice lady, proper British lady. She looks like essentially what women look like in her generation. She's wearing attractive clothing. She's a nice lady. Nursing is a hard job. Nursing, you have to see people at their worst, shall we say. And in nursing, you're trying to bring a lot of benevolence to what you're doing. Well, she's very good. And when wounded soldiers, both British and German, make their way, or they're brought to her, she treats everybody equally. She gives everybody medical attention. I would consider that to be very admirable. On the other hand, she's got British men there that have been wounded, and she wants to get them back in the fight. So after they're patched up, usually when men go into hospitals, they can be there for a period of time, and when they feel better, they can go out and do something else. Sometimes men come in for medical attention that are capable of still walking. You might be clipped in the arm or in the side, something like this, and you do have the ability to keep moving. What she does is this. Before all the borders are completely sealed off primarily, and that takes a while, she figures out ways of trying to smuggle these semi-wounded or somewhat recovered British soldiers out of Belgium so they can get back to Britain and get back in the fight again. We believe she's pretty good at it. We believe that maybe 200 British troops were able to escape because she helped them. Now, according to the laws of wars, remember we're up here, you shoot spies and saboteurs. In other words, you shoot people that are aiding and abetting the enemy, and they're not wearing uniforms. She's a nurse. She's not in the military at all. Does she fit within the area of spy? Yeah, she fits the definition. She's clearly aiding the British. So she's clearly, well, they try her. She's found guilty. I think she is guilty. But then, following the dictums, and believe me, the British and the French shoot spies as well. She's shot in a firing squad by a firing squad in 1915. The British, of course, are going to make big hay out of this. They're going to make big statements. These terrible Germans, they're butchering people. Well, according to definition, they can. Perhaps the most famous woman in the First World War is Mata Hari. We'll come back and talk about her a little bit later. She's also shot by the French in 1917 for being a spy. The case against her is, according to some historians, does indicate she was a spy. The case against her, by other historians, take a look at it and say, we're not actually sure she was involved or not. Well, she did take money for information, but we're not sure she ever gave the information. She's shot in 1917. She's a woman. Maybe I'll... One of the reasons why we pay attention to Mata Hari is that she's an exotic dancer. In other words, she's wearing very little, sometimes almost nothing at all. She's dancing on the stages in Paris. Paris does have a reputation back then, as now, having a little bit of sleazy entertainment. You can see a lot more than a well-turned ankle from these ladies. She's attractive as a historical character because she kind of fits the old story of the femme fatale. The really nice-looking woman who's going to seduce you for your secrets and send all this valuable information to the enemy. So, as an exotic dancer, she kind of fits that mold. And that's going to be more important in motion pictures in the 20s and 30s. In fact, they're going to make motion pictures about Mata Hari. If it's a crime to shoot Cavell, why is it not a crime to shoot Mata Hari? Once again, it really depends on who's doing this. If the enemy's doing it, it's crime. If we're doing it, well, she deserved what she got. One of her advantages, she had mixed ancestry, so her skin wasn't terribly white. She's a little bit dark, had a little bit of brown in her, which made her seem even more exotic. Now, to keep from embarrassing everybody, I won't pull up the real sleazy photographs of her. But we can see once again, if we do it, it's fine. If they do it, it's a crime. Let's get back to Edith Cavell as I move on. Edith Cavell, say it right. Okay. We often forget that Luxembourg was taken by the Germans as well. Now, the Luxembourg forces largely has a police force. It really doesn't have the ability to resist the Germans. So the Luxembourgers essentially allow the Germans to come through. What else are they going to do? They fight, they'll be destroyed. And they're literally hopeless. Maybe they could throw a few bullets in the direction of the Germans. So when the Germans occupy Luxembourg, it is a much more benevolent occupation. We don't hear nearly as much about them running out of food and forced labor and grabbing their resources. But Belgium's a different matter. Belgium did resist. And there are areas of France. Remember, maybe I'd get a map of the Western Front, even though we haven't talked about the establishment of the Western Front yet. But we're talking about people that were behind enemy lines. Yeah, here we go. Any one of these work. Now, Belgium's up here, as you can see. The Germans, after the defeat of the Schlieffen Plan, did pull back. Yeah, the race to the sea, I almost made it look like the British and the French and the Germans went straight up. No, actually, the Germans pulled back a little bit. Another one of the reasons why the Germans have a tendency to get the high ground, because they make choices to have the high ground when they arrive. But see, there's these sections of France. It's not just Belgium that's occupied by Germany. There's sections of France that's occupied by Germany. We usually say that about 8 million people, I'll come back to this later, that about 8 million people are actually behind the German lines in Belgium, and another 2 million French are behind the German lines in France. Now, this really doesn't include young men, because all the men are in the military. Of course, when the Germans come in, a lot of these people do try to flee, but the Germans come too fast and overwhelm them. Literally go faster than they can escape. There's the attempt, of course, for the Belgians to try to run away as well. By the time we get to the Battle of Marne, it has been argued there's as many as 1 million refugees in Paris fleeing from these areas. But still, there's about 2 million Frenchmen that are behind German lines. So what I'm saying about Belgium is also largely true about the areas of France and the people of France behind the German lines. Can we say the occupation is harsh? Absolutely. People are pushed around, people are insulted. We have people are very closely watched. You have, in some cities, you have a German soldier literally on every street corner. And that man's looking around in case there's any trouble. Of course, he's there with his rifle. He can bayonet. He can be pretty awful guy if he wants to be. The occupation's harsh, particularly when the blockade gets going. The Germans come into France, these occupied areas of France, and come into Belgium and take their food. They take their cattle, they take their grain, and leaving them in a very, very bad situation. It'd be tempting to say they left them to starve. In reality, had they not had Belgian relief, which we will talk about later, it would have been very, very harsh for these people. It's difficult to see how they could have survived without foodstuffs coming in later. Something else is involved here, not just taking their food. They take their resources. The Germans try to take their factories. They do take their factories and try to get them manufacturing goods that the Germans need for their war machine and also to maintain the home front. And some of this gets involved in forced labor. simply round up people that you think are physically capable of doing the labor. Usually the young men aren't available, but the older men, the middle-aged men are. And you take them to factories, and sometimes you take them into Germany, where you're not paid for this. It's literally forced labor, where you come in and force people to work in the farms and in the factories. This is against the laws of war, sure it is. But the Germans do it because, remember, they think they're pressed, they think they have to. We're going to be discussing reparations at the end of the war. We talk about the Peace of Paris in 1919 and the Treaty of Versailles. Let me introduce you to this question right now. Now, usually when I'm in a class, and I try not to be unfair, but sometimes professors do spring things on us, in this case on you, without giving you adequate time to prepare, adequate time to think about it. But a question I sometimes like to ask my students about this time in the course is, do you believe in collective guilt? By that I mean, there were Germans under the guise of the German government who did bad things. Their officers order them to do bad things. And if they don't do it, they can be in big trouble. Now, these are people that happen to be within the nation of Germany. However, in collective guilt, does that mean everybody in Germany? Remember, there's about 65 million Germans. Everybody in Germany is therefore guilty of what some people did in the name of Germany on a number of occasions. So is everybody guilty? See, that's an unfair question. The reason why I'm saying this, it's difficult. That's a challenging question. There's all kinds of things you have to bring into consideration. So when I ask that question, it's kind of a think piece rather than I really expect people to come out with profound answers. So students have a tendency to look at me and go, Nobody usually raised their hand. So having hopefully stimulated their thinking, then I hop in and kind of give my take on it. Now, this is very important, collective guilt, because when the war is over, there's collective punishment. You see, according to the laws of war, you are to pay compensation up here. So if damage is done, who should pay? The people who did the bad things, the government, the officers who ordered it done, the men who actually did the actions, hauled off the forced labor back to Germany, or the entire German nation. This is not just a hypothetical question. It's a question that we do not easily dodge, because there's going to be huge amounts of reparations, money involved in discussing that question. A situation I sometimes throw out to students to try to get people thinking about it. For example, I've already mentioned I was alive during Vietnam. Yes, I'm a veteran. I did join the Navy Reserves after Vietnam. So during the time of Vietnam, I'm not in the service. I'm some guy. I'm in high school. I'm in college. I'm just some guy. Well, as you know, the Tet Offensive in 1968 took place starting on the 31st of January, 1968. And it goes on for weeks, and the largest casualties the United States are ever going to suffer during the entire war take place in those days and weeks. Heavy fighting, a lot of brutality. When the North Vietnamese take away, they come in and literally slaughter thousands of people. There are some atrocities that are committed by U.S. troops. The most famous took place in a village called My Lai 4. When U.S. combat troops come into a village, all the men are gone, they're in the Viet Cong. They come in and go on a murdering rampage. And they butcher hundreds of people, women and children included. The numbers were always in dispute. A reasonable number, which we sometimes see thrown out, is about 500. Now, that could have been more than that, could have been less. Now, I'm 18 years old. I'm the military age. I'm not in the military. I'm 18 years old. Now remember, in 1968, 18-year-olds cannot vote. You couldn't vote at that time until you were 21. When they changed the law, I voted for the very first time a couple of weeks shy of my 23rd birthday. Because a couple of years earlier, when I had just a couple of weeks shy of being 21 in the previous election. So I'm almost 23. By that time, we have withdrawn all U.S. combat troops in Vietnam. So I can't directly make a statement in government. So am I responsible for what happened in My Lai? I did not agree with that. I didn't even know about it. We didn't hear about it until about a year later. Am I responsible? I am an American. I was American then. See, that becomes a very difficult question. If you believe in collective guilt, can we actually say that perhaps maybe the Belgians should suffer for what the Belgians have done? Now, I spent all this time talking about what the Germans did to the Belgians. Let's go back a few decades. Let's go back to the 19th century. When the Belgians, not everybody in Belgium by any means, but under the guise of King Leopold II, there is a very brutal occupation of the Congo. We call it the Belgian Congo. One way or another, a lot of this is forced labor, a lot of this is working to death, a lot of this is just killing for the fun of it. But we do believe there was ballpark 20 million people, maybe in the Congo Basin, when the Belgians came in. Within a couple of decades, the numbers we believe are down to maybe 10 million. So did they kill 10 million people? I don't believe so. But can we say there's the heavy loss of life? A lot of this will be people running away, probably children that would have been born otherwise were not born. But can we say, one way or another, there's 10 million less people in the Congo because of Belgium than had been the case before the colonial era? So if the Belgians' collective guilt are responsible for this, the loss of 10 million people, and there's 8 million Belgians, if you believe in collective guilt, should we say that all the Belgians should have been killed? It still doesn't go tit for tat. 8 million does not equal 10 million. So let's go and kill all the Belgians. Oh, I know, people in Africa are black, so they don't really matter as much as white people do. But this becomes a challenging question. I'm not going to tell you I have an easy answer for this. But these are the kinds of things that we have to address. Let's go on. Talk about the war on the Eastern Front. Remember all the combats going on in the West. Well, at the same time, exactly the same time, there's considerable combat going on the Eastern Front. And we take a look at this, and we look at one of the more spectacular German victories of the entire war, and this is the Battle of Tannenberg. Let's get your map. Remember, the German war plans simply state this, that they have 42 days to beat France before Russia can come in. But remember Russia's secret mobilization? Remember, they're mobilizing secretly before they announce the formal mobilization on July 30th. And they're mobilizing in exactly the areas that face Germany. So they are able to strike earlier. They're going to strike in 15 days. So the strike takes place before the 42 days that Germany was hoping on. Let's take a look at what happens. East Prussia. We need a map of Germany. Well, let's get it right. Here's Germany, 1914, the Russian Empire. Of course, the Russians want to straighten out their map, taking Galicia from Austria down here, But look at this large enclave right here. This appears to be sticking out way into Russian territory. This is what we call East Prussia. So the Russians want to take this out. They're going to use an assault by 2 Russian armies. There's a man by the name of Paul von Rennenkampf. Now, that sounds like a German name, doesn't it? This man's a Russian, but he does have German ancestry. This is not that uncommon. When Peter the Great, among other czars, were trying to westernize Russia, they tried to invite people to come in who had expertise, the Dutch, the Germans, to bring them in and to help modernize the state. In this case, probably one of Rennenkampf's ancestors was one of these people that came into Russia, and obviously his family and his ancestors did quite well. Therefore, he was able to work up quite nicely in the military. So he's controlled the first Russian army. Let's come back to our. Wow, that's not as easy as I thought. I want a little more clarity, shall we say? This is perhaps one of the good ways of looking at it. It's a better map. He attacks from this direction. Now, one of the reasons why you don't attack the center right here, so the Masurian Lakes. They're a very formidable physical obstacle. It's going to be very difficult for the Russians or anybody else to punch through right there. So we're going to have 2 attacks. Paul von Rennenkampf is going to come here from the north, while Alexander Samsonov, the second Russian army, is going to strike in this direction. Large armies here, large armies here. It seems like it should work. Because remember, there's only 20 German divisions here. It should be a pretty easy thing to overwhelm them. Well, the strength of the Russian army, they have a lot of manpower. Can we say they're not as well organized as they should have been? Can we say the men aren't trained as best as they should? They don't have as much heavy equipment, in other words, as much artillery as they should have to face the Germans, who have a tendency to have more heavy artillery. You see, these things come into play. There's also some other issues. We should never overlook the issue of personality. We have personalities. People cooperate or don't cooperate with the people in our society, largely sometimes on the basis of how well you like each other, how well you support each other. And Paul von Rennenkampf and Alexander Samsonov hate each other. They hate each other severely. They hate each other's guts. Not really exactly sure what the issues were. But these men were not leading armies, but they're also involved in the war with Japan, 1904 and 1905. Whatever reasons, somebody said something, looked wrong, stood on somebody's toes, insulted them, whatever. These men hate each other viciously. And they hate each other to the point where cooperation becomes challenging. You see, you've got to talk to each other to make sure you're coordinating your efforts. And when you don't want to talk to each other, you hate other people, what other people are saying, you don't want to do what they suggest, then you can see the lack of coordination can hurt in a military situation. I mentioned earlier, way early in the class, that we do have a situation where we have people that are becoming highly literate. Remember, we usually say, probably before 1900, that Germany achieved a level of almost total literacy, and other countries are close behind. However, Russia is lagging somewhat. I'm not going to say that a large number of people are literate. In fact, the heavy majority of people are literate in the German society. However, when the Russians, they say that, I meant to say Russian, not German. Large number of people in Russia are literate. But can we say some of these are semi-literate? The point I'm trying to make is this. You have to have a large number of men in intelligence. Communications is very, very important. You can have various codes. When you communicate on the Eastern Front, you tend to use codes that are broadcast in the air so they can be intercepted. And the distances are large. To lay a cable here, particularly in a flexible or mobile combat situation, is literally impractical. So you have to broadcast these things. And of course, the Germans can intercept them. Now, if they're in code, the Germans can't read them, and you say, well, it's just gobbledygook. It means literally nothing. However, the Russians are afraid that in using complex code systems, they do not have enough men who can be trained rapidly enough to handle these easily. They actually use codes that the Germans can easily read. It doesn't take months to break these codes. The Germans already know what they're saying. You could imagine the enormous advantage you would have under this kind of circumstance. If you know what your enemy is doing, and sometimes you know their morale and how well they're supported. So you can, if you know what they're doing, you can much more easily counter what they're doing. These are enormous advantages. The man who is the head, and this is the German 8th Army, remember, the German 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th are actually on the Western Front. This is the German 8th Army. And the man who is leading this is Maximilian von Prittwitz. Prittwitz looks at a map and he goes, oh my goodness, I'm being hit here, I'm being hit here, I'm being squoze out, I'm heavily outnumbered. My quality of the German troops, of course, are better, but on the other hand, he's heavily outnumbered. He knows he's got a problem. Well, what on earth shall I do? What Prittwitz wants to do is to withdraw the German army back to the Vistula River so he has a strong defensive position. In other words, he's going to retreat and surrender East Prussia to the Russians. Now, from a military standpoint, that looks like a pretty good idea. However, let's go back to the map right here. You see, he wants to go back here. Let's look in the scope of German history. Germany unifies 1871 around the state of Prussia. Prussia's capital is in Berlin, and Prussia for centuries controlled areas of northern and central Germany. The noble families, who are still very influential in the German government, the old Prussian noble families, most of which originate over here. So this isn't just the territory on the map. We say this is something that many of the leaders of the government say this is unacceptable, to give up our homeland. Of course, when the Russians come in, I've already mentioned this, they're not very nice people. When the Russians come in, they're burning villages. So the atrocities that we see in Belgium and some other places, during France, during the First World War, actually has already been foisted upon the Germans. Now, these people with royal background look over here and say, we can't lose this. And not only this, and sometimes these people in government and military over here still have estates over here. And this is subject to physical destruction. So Prittwitz is fired. We're not withdrawing. And the man who comes to replace him is Paul von Hindenburg. Paul von Hindenburg is in retirement. Look at his age, not a young man anymore. Let's be pretty old. He's going to be important in the Battle of Tannenberg, fighting on the Eastern Front. And later on, when Germany virtually goes into a military dictatorship in 1916, he and Ludendorff, remember we already met Ludendorff, he and Ludendorff are essentially going to be tit for tat. These are the guys on top. Now, Ludendorff does write memoirs. I've read them. They're an easy read. Very nice. He's writing fast, so he's not getting into big kind of discussions. He does have to say that, yeah, in these between me and Hindenburg, in reality, I'm the brains. I'm calling the shots. The Battle of Tannenberg gets to be this point of pride for the Germans. See, at the end of the First World War, they don't have a lot to be proud about. But this stunning victory at Tannenberg actually turns these areas over here into a tourist place. And Germans come there and they want to hear about the victory. And that makes for a good play. Now, sometimes Ludendorff would show up and talk to the people. He's talking about Hindenburg's contribution to what's going on here. And a little bit like people talk about where Washington slept during the Revolution. Washington slept here. Washington slept in a lot of places. But in a similar vein, Ludendorff is saying this is where Hindenburg was. And this is the way he put it on occasion. This is where Hindenburg slept before the battle. This is where Hindenburg slept after the battle. And this is where Hindenburg slept during the battle. Like he was really out of it. That's really not true. Yeah, Hindenburg does look at Ludendorff and say, this man, I can work with this man, he's helpful. But to say that Hindenburg did not plan or did not execute this battle is quite misleading. He is very, very good. Well, what does happen? You figure out ways of beating these armies one at a time. Is this map helpful? We do talk about the First World War as being a modern war involving mechanisms, machinery, and trains. So what the Germans have here is a good rail network. The Russians are coming on foot. The Germans have a good rail network. So what happens is this. Hindenburg does not withdraw. He's able to deploy his forces at one and then the other. Actually, I think I have this backwards. He has a defensive position here, as you can see on this map. It's largely a cavalry screen. And then Hindenburg hits down here. And he reverses and he's able to hit up here before Rennenkampf can do much of anything about it. The reason why this is able to happen is by the brilliant rail network. He can move his men very rapidly on trains. People say, well, this is a good example of how we've modernized warfare. Well, let's play American history for just 1 minute. Early in the Civil War, 1861, the United States Army attacks the Confederate Army at a creek called Bull Run, first Bull Run. The Confederates tend to call this Manassas. The man who is the head of the Confederate Army is Beauregard. And he's heavily outnumbered. He's going to get beat. However, in the Shenandoah Valley, Western Virginia, there's another Confederate Army under Joe Johnston. He's able to get there in time to help Beauregard not only hold his position, but to defeat the Federals because he can take his men on rail. It's not true, therefore, that in 1914, that this is our first example of using a rail network to win a battle. No. First Manassas, first Bull Run, it's a very good example going back quite a number of years. Can we say this is a stunning victory? When it does come to combat, the Germans are better disciplined, heavier equipment. So actually, when they go toe-to-toe with the Russians, they are superior. Well, these people have been defeated. Samsonov got beaten back here. And he says, now I got to go to the Tsar and tell him what I have done. So he's withdrawing. He's going to go back. He should go back and report, apparently. And he finally he has his driver pull off to a grove of trees. Says, I'm going to go out there and relieve myself. And he goes out there and hears a gunshot. He killed himself with his pistol. Well, that might be a moral statement, at least what he's trying to make. But in reality, if he did have any military expertise and ability, we would largely think a commander of an army would have this ability. Killian himself probably did the command structure of the Russians on the Eastern Front. No favors at all. Well, we're not going to follow all the battles. There's the Battle of Manchurian Lakes, where the Germans are following up and fighting up in this area. Yes, remember that 6 divisions, which I mentioned, was withdrawn from the Western Front when they were badly needed in the Battle of the Marne. and they showed up too late to participate in the Battle of Tannenberg. Remember, they're in transit. However, after the Battle of Tannenberg, these 6 divisions do show up, good combat troops, and now we're seeing that we're getting more troops on the Eastern Front to win a series of German victories, which tend to push the Russians back. Okay, we see fighting up here. The Vistula River, of course, runs right through downtown Warsaw. So the Germans have kind of reverse scenario here. While the Russians are trying to destroy the Germans right here, the Germans are looking down here and say, oh my goodness, we've got this long front. It's relatively exposed. So they want to straighten this out in order that they will have less area to defend. A straight line is easier to defend than a curve. There's less miles involved. And they do need to happen. They do need to help Austria-Hungary, because Austria-Hungary does not do well in the early phases of the war. Quite frankly, Austria-Hungary doesn't do well in most phases of the war. So let's go all the way back early days and weeks of the war in 1914. The Austrians are going to attack Serbia. Well, that's the reason why we get started in the war. Takes a little while to get everybody together. Yes, there's shelling going on, but it takes a few weeks for them to actually start invading Serbian territory. Now, Serbia's got done fighting a couple of wars. Both the First and Second Balkan Wars. Can we say their learning curve has already been straightened out? They know what they're doing. The Austrians haven't fought in so long. They have no experienced troops. They really don't have experienced commanders. And rather than knowing how to prepare and advance efficiently and effectively, they don't know. So Serbia trounces them. Yes, yeah. The Austrian, Hungarians, they come in, they grab territory, and they're involved in brutal actions as well. They're reacting very similar as the Germans were in Belgium. So when the Austro-Hungarians go into Serbia, they're killing civilians. That kind of thing does happen. Once again, makes these people look very bad. Something else I should mention is that before the First World War, France, of course, doesn't like Germany. And since Austria-Hungary is an ally of Germany, the French don't like them either. So what the French had done before the First World War is they had sold the Serbians a lot of these magnificent French 75 artillery pieces. Now remember, when you buy things, sometimes loans are involved. I have to be suspicious once again. Maybe these weren't actually loans, they're actually gifts. So however, the Serbians have a lot of French 75s, a lot of very good field pieces. And the Austrians really have nothing of that ability to face them with. So there's an advantage as far as weaponry is concerned, particularly when the Austrians and Hungarians are marching in. The artillery pieces do a number on them. So there's no conquest. There's an attempt. There's an invasion of Serbia in 1914. There's no conquest. The Austrians fail to take Serbia. The Austrians do not do well in Galicia when the Russians invade. Now, one of the mistakes, can we say, that the Russians did make in the war is they attacked in 2 areas. Of course, Austria is in big trouble because they've got to fight in Serbia and Galicia. They have a 2-front war. The Germans, they have a 2-front war, the West and the East. But the Russians, if the Russians had placed all of their manpower in one place or the other, they probably had a bigger chance of being successful. However, they get beat at Tannenberg up here, and they are, however, quite successful at Galicia. The Austrians have numerous problems. I already mentioned the problems with military budgets. They're not as big as other countries. They don't have as large a percentage of manpower in the military as other countries do. But some of their biggest single problems is internal discord. Remember Pan-Slavism? There's a lot of Slavic people living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they are not terribly keen on fighting against their Slavic enemies. They're not enemies, they're Slavic neighbors, Russia and Serbia being good examples. The ethnic problem is very difficult for the Austrians and Hungarians to resolve. The units that speak German, the Austrian units, about 25% of the army, tend to be the best troops. Can we say they're a little bit more connected, at least linguistically, with the royal family who speaks German? There's a little bit more at stake with them. The Magyars, also known as Hungarians, tend to be, shall we say, the less, not as good as the German-speaking Austro-Hungarians, but they're better than the various Slavic groups. There's interesting accounts. If you're an officer in the Austro-Hungarian army, you better be multilinguistic, because you're going to have to talk to various people. And sometimes these men, of course, you don't have to know everything in a language, but you have to be able to understand complaints. You have to be able to understand that, you'll be able to tell people in a manner that they can understand your orders. And there are times when these men are polyglots, they know a number of languages. And then they go out and they talk to some troops, they don't know those languages at all. See, I'm talking about major groups. You have all these minor groups. These men are hard to motivate. I'm not going to say that they are worthless, but I am going to say there are inherent weaknesses in the Austro-Hungarian army that make it very, very challenging for them to lead an effective war. One of the ways we can understand the war is that Germany, time and again, when they badly need their forces elsewhere, have to send units, have to send divisions to help the Austro-Hungarians in their war against the Russians, their war against the Serbians, and starting in 1915, their war against the Italians. Germany can't just walk away from Austria-Hungary and say, well, we don't need you. They do need them. Even units that are weak are going to severely help the war effort. But they have to be bolstered, or the Russians and Serbians will beat them. The Germans say we are shackled to a corpse. That's quite true. Now, Germany has a problem. They've got to keep Austria in the war. They really do not have the manpower. They really do not have the strength to fight aggressively on the Western Front and Eastern Front. So there's a major shift now in the German war effort. Initially, they were going to beat the French. Once they beat France, they can turn on Russia and probably beat them without a great deal of difficulty. This is probably the case. That was the initial effort. That is the von Schlieffen plan. But then they come up with the idea of shifting the war, change in strategy. We will no longer be hitting on the West, over here on the Western Front. We are now going to hold in the West. There's going to be a couple of major offensives. We'll talk about them later, when the Germans do attack in the Western Front. But they're really holding until 1918 in the West. In the meantime, they're attacking in the East. So we're shifting troops over here, changing strategy, hold in the West, hit in the East. If they could knock Russia out of the war rapidly, they could have turned their strength on the West much more efficiently and earlier on, with bigger chance of success. On paper, this looks to be like a pretty good idea, but once again, the day after the football game, I can make decisions on what should have been done. I look at this and I say, I'm not sure this was the best thing to do. On the other hand, I'm not sure what else they could have done. But let's look at the cost of this. France is going to continue to build up its military. It's going to get more and more men in the service. Now let's take a look at Britain. Remember the BEF. We're talking 80,000 men that are deployed. Now the resources, the manpower, the economic resources of Britain is huge. They got like 50 million population. They can get a lot more boys in uniform. Besides this, they have the empire behind them. Canada, New Zealand, Australia. Pop right in. We are now defending the British Empire. So as you're holding in the West, I guess my wife got that. If we're holding in the West and hitting in the East, the West is going to become a bigger problem because it will take a few years, but the British do mobilize their small army into a very big, very compact, very powerful army. They've got the empire behind them. They've got other nations who are very, very good combat troops. The Australians, New Zealanders, and Canadians have the finest combat reputation in the First World War. These people are awfully good. Now France has an empire behind them too. One of the more famous groups that came up and fight with the French are the Senegalese, people from Africa. They're good. You say, wait a minute, wasn't the treatment of the colonies very bad by both Britain and France? Well, that's largely true, particularly in Africa. So why would the French colonies in Africa send men up to fight in France? A lot of these people think that if they support France, if they come up and are willing to fight, bleed, and die for France, that French treatment of them will improve, and that they will be able to eventually get their independence. So in a certain way, they think it's to their advantage. Well, the French don't treat them much better anyway, even after the war. So now we have a changing situation. This is how we're going to actually fight the war for the next 4 years. If you want to speculate, could the Germans actually held in the East and continue to hit in the West before the British are able to build up this huge army that does and can do and does severe damage to the Germans? If we're going to do that, then what's going to happen to Austria? Austria is going to collapse. And if Austria collapses, how is the Germans going to maintain their position in the East? It's probably, even though I think that in the long run, you're going to get hurt very badly for this idea, it might have been the only thing they could have done. Now we're talking about the brutality in the war, and we're going to continue to do this. We're not done with that by any means. Let me take a look at compassion. Sometimes when we see nations go to war, we do see the worst in them. Yeah, we see brutal things. We see starvation. We see blockades. We see attacking civilians. We see sinking neutral ships. All these kind of things happen. However, is it right to say that when you go to war, you see the worst in people? You certainly do see that. Some people want to say, if you look at the entire ledger, however, everything we're discussing, that in reality, you not only see the worst in people, worst in societies and communities, but you also have a tendency to see the best. You see, when you're in a situation where brutality does occur, you'll find people that go along with it, largely to get through, to survive. And a lot of times, however, you do see people that will go in a different direction. So let's take a look at compassion. Let's take a look at the kinds of things that we can say were done, shall we say, a little bit more benignly. One of the more famous incidents of compassion is the Christmas truce starting in December 1914. This happens. I'll talk more about spontaneousness in a minute. We're going to find these kinds of things happening on the Western Front. The most famous ones are in the West, but this also happens on the Eastern Front. I will make mention of that in a few minutes. When you are going to stop shooting each other, You do this at great personal risk. What if you say to the people in the trenches over there, oh, by the way, we're not going to fire you today. And they say, yeah, we won't fire you either. So what if you decide to stand on the parapet, stand up on top of the trench, wave at each other, do other various things like that? What if somebody down the line says, wait a minute, I don't like that man? There is great personal risk involved. If you're going to leave your trenches, if you're going to walk out in no man's land, the area between the trenches, and start to fraternize, and there's just one guy within hundreds of yards of you who says, wait a minute, I don't like Germans, you can be killed. It happens, and if we read the British accounts, it happens almost in a strange way. You see, there's what we call the din of battle. You can hear a gunshot, artillery piece, and machine guns for miles, for many miles in some cases. Artillery pieces go way, way out. I happen to live in Orem, and I'm not that far from the Provo gun range, which happens to be up in the mouth of Provo Canyon. It's several miles away, 4 or 5 miles. The gun range up there, you can shoot small caliber weapons, you can shoot high-powered rifles. And a lot of times I'm going out to get the newspaper. Newspapers are very important to me because I get to read the comics. When I go out and pick up the newspapers on Saturday mornings, I can hear gunfire. It's distant, bomb, bomb, boom, boom. They're shooting. That's several miles away. As you know, when the atmosphere is more dense, and I happen to live 4,800 feet above sea level, when the atmosphere is more dense, closer to sea level, sound travels better. When there's more moisture in the air, sound travels better as well. The point I'm trying to make is this. Anytime, anywhere along the trenches, there's always gunfire. You don't always have a heavy barrage, but very often you'll have a shell go over here, a shell go over here, a mortar round go over here. There's people up there watching to see if there's enemy out there, and bang, bang, bang. Take a shot in their direction. Sometimes just to let them know you're here. And then there's the rap of machine gun. You hear this all the time. Actually, after a while, you almost get used to it. Unless it's a shell coming in your direction, you can hear them coming in very often. Shell coming your direction, you say, you kind of forget it and keep on doing. What becomes eerie on nightfall, on December 24th, this is Christmas Eve. The sun goes down. Remember, this is December, so the sun goes down very early. The sun goes down, and then there's silence. See, if you're an Englishman sitting in a trench, go, what on earth is going on? The Germans, in some sectors, had spent many days, bringing up boughs of fir trees. And they bring up these boughs of fir trees. And when the sun goes down on the 24th, they put these boughs up in their trenches. And they light candles on the boughs. Now, any kind of light in a trench during the First World War after dark is extremely dangerous. A flicker of a match, a candle, anything like that is inviting a bullet. See, if there's a little light over there and your enemy's over there, they got their snipers, they have the high-powered rifles. They're laying down there and they're watching the trench. You see a flicker of light. You take a bullet and you go, bam, you take them out. According to many studies men have done on when you're firing a weapon, if you are spotted by your enemy, it usually takes about 3 seconds for them to kill you. You see, they have to see you, they have to bring the sight over, and they have to squeeze it off. So lighting a match in 3 seconds, you're a dead man. There's an old story, the old superstition. There's a lot of superstitions. Black cats, the number 13. We're aware of all of this. There's a superstition that they call that you should not use one match to light 3 cigarettes. Now, I think lighting 1 cigarette takes more than 1 second. The idea is there's danger in 3. A lot of times people during and even well after the war, if you got your buddies and you're all lighting up and you strike your match, you light 2 and then you blow it out and you get another match. That goes back to the idea of 3. When the Germans put the candles up on the trenches, they're inviting to be killed. They're inviting to be shot. However, not much of this happens. There are times when the Germans put up a Christmas tree and the British shoot out all the candles. Most of the time, the entire German trench is simply lit up. Oh my goodness. So the British are going, what's going on? And then you start singing carols. Some of the carols that the Germans sing are recognizable to English speakers. Perhaps the most famous of all Christmas songs, Christmas carols, is Stille Nacht. What's that in English? Silent Night. Now, the British don't know the words, and the Germans are singing in German. Usually. Sometimes they switch over to English. But of course the British know what's happening. They can hear the tunes. Another famous German Christmas carol that's been translated in English is O Tannenbaum, O Christmas Tree, O Christmas Tree, O Christmas Tree. You're all familiar with this. The Germans start singing these songs. It's like a serenade. The British are listening. After a while they go, give a little applause, good song. Sometimes the British start singing songs as well. We're at war, and we have the Germans and we have the British singing songs to each other. This has happened in areas of when the French and the Germans are facing each other as well. This is not just what happens with the British. However, we have more accounts coming from the British. There were places along the front where this did not occur, or when the Germans put up the candles, the French shot them out. But can we say in the main, the heavy majority of areas, all up and down the Western Front, now have simply ceased to fight? What do you make of this? There was one place on a German on the Western Front where the firing had not all ceased. Even though the Germans are singing songs and they've got little boughs of small Christmas trees with the candles on them. And there's still firing taking place. There was a German cook who could hear the British still firing their guns. And he went out and took one of these little boughs, one of these little Christmas trees with candles on it. He stood up, walked across no man's land. Anybody could have killed him. Walked up front, stood in front of the British troops and said, "Don't you know what day this is?" The firing in that sector quit. These kind of things go on all night. When it really gets eerie is the next morning. This is Christmas Day. Of course, this is France. It's foggy in the morning. This is December. It's hard to see. The British look out of their trenches and they see the Germans sometimes standing up. They want to party. They want to talk. It takes a lot of guts for them to do that. It's much guts for the British officers to go out and talk to them. And the Germans say, and sometimes the Germans hold signs, "You no shoot, we no shoot." They go over and say, and they simply call a truce. The war is over for today. At least for today. Happens when the French troops, happens with the British troops. They meet the Germans in the middle. And of course, the Germans who speak English are going to come out and make more conversations. The Germans don't speak English. Hold back a little bit, at least as far as conversation is concerned, by using a few words you might know in German. And and a few words that people might know from the Germans might know a few English words, the English might know a few German words, and with hand gestures you can get by fairly easily. Here we have a German soldier, and here we have British soldiers. This is also a German soldier. You can tell by the little symbol on his cap. This is an Englishman right here. Yeah, they're smokers. A lot of them are. We'll talk about smoking rates later on during the war. A lot of these men smoke. You trade tobacco. The Germans have a tendency to have good Turkish tobacco. Of course, the British have fine tobacco from other areas, so they're quite nice in trading these things back and forth. You trade little symbols, little German symbols, and little British symbols are traded back and forth. One of the things that the British liked were German belt buckles. And the belt buckles said things like "Gott mit uns," may God be with us, or God is with us. And a lot of the Germans, the British, like to see these things. So you trade for them. Sometimes you trade caps. This man is wearing what we call the Pickelhaube. Pickel essentially is a protrusion. They're kind of dorky looking in my estimation. We'll talk more about helmets in a little while, but they're not terribly effective helmets because they're made out of leather. Had they been made out of metal that could actually shield you from shrapnel, that would have been much more effective. But wouldn't it be fun to have some of these things? A few days before the Christmas truce, there had been attacks by the British on German positions. Very unfortunately for the British, these had not gone well and many men were killed. In fact, there are many corpses laying in no man's land that are British. When you come out for a Christmas truce, this becomes a little bit unnerving, does it not? The men are dead. One of the first things they did in a lot of places was bury the British dead. The British would bring out a few shovels, a few picks. The Germans would do the same thing. A lot of times they bury these men right in the middle of no man's land. This was very common during the war. A lot of times it was just too dangerous to try to bring off a corpse. Who wants to get a man killed for a man who's already dead? So you bury men in shell holes or wherever it was convenient to do so. Very commonly done. So they bury the dead, and the Germans helped bury the British dead. Of course, it is tradition, if you're religious, to say a few words over the corpse. So they bury the dead. The British, of course, say their prayers in English. In English, yes, they do. And then the Germans bow their heads and say something, prayers in German. I've already mentioned this. You exchange gifts. The Germans haven't been hurt so badly by the blockade yet. So they still have a few sweet things, marmalade and whatever, that the English tend to like. Of course, everybody likes candies and chocolates. The Germans have chocolates. The British also have chocolates. You exchange these kinds of things. Am I running out of time? Yeah, I'm getting close. One of the most famous soccer matches in the history of soccer. Remember, these are young men. Why on earth you have a soccer ball out on the Western Front, I'm not quite sure. Maybe when you get rotated out, you don't have to be right at the front. You boys can kick it around. And rather than saying these are really formal matches, we can actually say it's more like a kickabout. Now, soccer is one of those games, shall we say, one of the easiest pickup games in the world. You just have to have the ball. A goal, you throw it on your hat, you can throw it on your coat, out of bounds, same kind of thing. Of course, you're on your honor if it happens to be offsides or something. The British and the Germans play a match. Somebody keeps score. The Germans win 3-2. Most famous soccer match probably in history. This goes on all day. Now, the sun's going to go down on December 25th. A lot of times men are shaking hands. A lot of times people are giving letters, say, I have friends in Germany, I have friends in Britain. Would you mail these letters for me? Normally during wartime, if you want to mail a letter from Germany to Britain, for example, you go through Switzerland. But isn't it easier if they're right there? Oh, I have friends. Remember, I speak English. I spend time in England. Can you at least tell my friends in London that I'm doing okay? Now, I'm not quite through with this, but I'm out of time. Please excuse me for going over. We will continue this next time. In the meantime, please enjoy.